On September the 4th, 1984, Canadians went to the polls in a realigning federal parliamentary election. Two of the three main political parties had new leaders. Brian Mulroney of the Progressive Conservatives had been in office since June 1983, and he had only entered the House of Commons through a by-election formally to be sworn in September 1983. Then the Liberals had since June 1984 had a new leader, former long-time member of the House of Commons and cabinet minister John Turner, who had in 1975 resigned as the federal finance minister, and in 1976 had also left the House of Commons to work as a corporate lawyer in Toronto. However, in March 1984, just a couple of weeks after Trudeau's resignation announcement, he had decided to return to active frontline politics and had been able to win the Liberal leadership. However, only 54% of the participating convention delegates had supported him on the decisive fourth ballot. So there was significant opposition to his candidacy, especially in Quebec, where Jean Chrétien, who had served, for example, as the federal finance minister, was notably popular, and he was probably Trudeau's private favorite as his successor, although Trudeau never publicly favored any one of the candidates. Turner took office as Prime Minister on June the 30th, 1984. He made, during his brief Prime Ministership, some major mistakes. One was to basically reappoint Trudeau's last government, in other words, to change only a few cabinet ministers. The second one was to agree to appoint over 70 fellow Liberals, including over 10 Liberal members of the House of Commons, to well-paid political civil service positions, so-called patronage appointments. Then the third one was to use such old phrases as make work programs instead of job creation programs. The fourth one was then in the second and more decisive election debate in late July 1984, to claim that the only way he could have assuredly become Prime Minister was to have made these appointments on Trudeau's behalf. That made him seem like a less than fully authorized Prime Minister, less than fully independent Prime Minister, and too dependent on his predecessor, who had already decided to retire from active politics. As he said, I had no option. Mulroney, playing the role of an outraged, civic-minded politician, claimed, "You had an option, sir. You could have said, I'm not going to do it. This is wrong for Canada, and I'm not going to ask Canadians to pay the price. You had an option, sir, to say no, and you chose to say yes to the old ways and the old attitudes of the Liberal Party. That, sir, if I may say respectfully, that is not good enough for Canadians." And Turner, who until that point had appeared fairly well prepared in the debate, looked weak and indecisive, and in the course of about 4 minutes, he lost whatever advantage he had still had over Mulroney, who had probably already clearly defeated him in terms of the voters' impressions the previous evening in the French language debate. After the debate, Turner's polls went downhill. Before the debate, either the Liberals had been leading or they had been neck and neck with the Progressive Conservatives, or the Progressive Conservatives had had a slight lead. But after that, Turner's polls sank, and so did the Liberals' polls. And on election day, some 50% of the participating Canadian voters who gave valid votes supported the Conservatives. The Liberals collapsed to just 28%. The New Democrats were able to basically hold their own with 19%, and then the minor parties and independents received the other 3%. Mulroney offered a more dynamic economic policy. The unemployment rate was still hovering around 11%, a byproduct of the early 1980s recession. He promised that Canada would be open for business, especially business from the United States, but also from various other countries. He also claimed that his liberal predecessors had largely soured the Canadian-US relations, and he would restore them. However, while he promised new jobs, tax cuts and so forth, he promised also to guard Canada's social programs as a sacred trust. He would to some extent break that promise. He also promised greater national unity, and indeed in the early years of his prime ministership that seemed to be the case. Many people who voted for the Progressive Conservatives in Quebec in 1984, and indeed many of them who would vote for them in 1988, had actually supported the Parti Québécois provincially. Mulroney also brought somewhat of a youthful touch to the prime ministership, being just 45 years old at the time of this election. By contrast, Turner was 55 years old and Broadbent was 54 years old. And the voter turnout rose dramatically to 75.3%. The Conservatives received 50% of the popular vote, or about 6,279,000 votes, and 211 seats out of 282. The Liberals had 28% of the popular vote, or about 3,516,000 votes, and collapsed to just 40 seats. The New Democrats had 18.8% of the vote, or about 2,360,000 votes, and took 30 seats. And Brian Mulroney would then implement major economic and other reforms during his first term, when he had that massive majority in the House of Commons. However, in the Senate, because of the long Liberal ruling period, the Liberals still held a majority, which caused him to water down some of the laws to make them more acceptable to the senators, although in practice the senators rarely can kill bills anymore.